Think back to your earliest memories of school. The smell of chalk dust, the shrill ring of the bell, the rows of desks, each one facing forward toward authority. For so many of us, education was more than a daily routine. It was a world where we laughed, struggled, dreamed, and where the very foundation of our identity began to take shape. But here's the unsettling question. What if the system we trusted to mold young minds was never designed for freedom? What if, beneath the surface of lessons and grades, it was carefully, deliberately engineered, not to liberate, but to control? What if education's hidden blueprint was never about opening doors, but about quietly locking them? For nearly 200 years, the modern public education system has stood as one of the most powerful institutions in human civilization. It has been hailed as the cornerstone of democracy, the great equalizer of opportunity, the engine of national progress. Nations have measured their success through literacy rates, test scores, graduation numbers, while parents sacrifice livelihoods, placing their children in classrooms with the hope of a brighter tomorrow. But beneath this noble vision lies a story far more complex and at times deeply unsettling. A story that whispers of hidden motives, of rulers and reformers who look to education not merely as a path to knowledge, but as a mechanism of control, a tool for shaping obedience, molding conformity, and aligning entire societies with the needs of economies and the will of political structures. Critics argue that mass education was never solely about the flourishing of the individual mind. Instead, it was also about producing citizens who would follow orders, workers who could slip neatly into the gears of industrial capitalism, and populations who would rarely, if ever, challenge the power structures that shaped their world. And here's the unsettling part. When you look around today, at rigid curricula, at endless standardized tests, at classrooms that still reward memorization over imagination, you begin to wonder, how much of that original design still lingers? The purpose of this research is not to dismiss education, far from it. Its aim is to peel back the layers of history, to study the blueprint of modern schooling with a sharper, more discerning lens. Where did this system truly come from? Whose interest did it serve? And most importantly, is it still serving us? The individuals, the dreamers, the innovators, or has it quietly bound us to an outdated model of the past? We will trace the origins of education as a project of social engineering, its rise in the 18th and 19th centuries, its philosophical roots, and the sweeping reforms that cemented it into the daily lives of billions. We will explore its global impact, how different cultures adapted or resisted these imported models, and what that has meant for creativity, entrepreneurship, and democratic vitality. And finally, we confront the most urgent question of our age. Can a system built for the world of steam and steel truly prepare us for an era ruled by algorithms and artificial intelligence? The stakes are immense. For individuals, recognizing the constraints and incentives embedded in traditional education is not just an intellectual exercise. It is an act of empowerment, because once you see the hidden design, you can begin to break free from it. You can reclaim your own learning, your own creativity, your own agency. For educators and policymakers, this lens is just as critical. Are we still training students to become compliant workers for systems that may soon vanish? Or are we nurturing citizens, inventors, and creators, people able to face the unpredictable challenges of the 21st century with resilience and vision? And for society as a whole, the question cuts to the very core of our collective future. Will education remain a mechanism for producing standardized followers, or can it evolve into a living system that unleashes independent thinkers, innovators, and leaders, those capable of confronting climate crises, navigating automation, and safeguarding democracy in an age of turbulence? This journey will carry us from the classrooms of 18th century Prussia to the factory floors of the Industrial Revolution, from the lofty ideals of Enlightenment philosophers to the stark realities of today's AI-driven economy. Along the way, we will question assumptions, confront uncomfortable truths, and search for answers to one of the most urgent debates of our time. Because in the end, education is not merely about textbooks and teachers. It is about identity, about who we become. And the question we must all face is this: are our schools shaping us into the people we truly want to be? When we think of education, we often picture it as a gift passed down from one generation to the next, a noble offering meant to uplift, to enlighten, to empower. But let's pause for a moment and ask, what if the true story of education's birth was not one of selfless generosity, but of calculated design? What if the blueprint for the very classrooms we once sat in was drawn not to nurture freedom of thought, but to instill obedience, to enforce discipline, and to secure control? Before the thunder of factories and the rise of smokestacks, education was already being wielded as a tool of order. In 16th century Germany, Martin Luther called for state-mandated schooling. On the surface, it seemed progressive. He wanted ordinary people to learn to read. But why? His ultimate aim was not intellectual liberation. It was religious discipline. If every child could read the Bible, they would no longer need priests to interpret it for them. They would instead internalize Protestant values and emerge as morally upright, obedient subjects of the state. And here we see the first crucial connection: schooling as a means to bind citizens to authority, not through chains, but through literacy, not through soldiers, but through sermons written directly into the curriculum. The Prussians took this seed and turned it into a system. After peasant uprisings shook the countryside in the mid-18th century, rulers realized brute force alone was not enough. They needed a subtler mechanism, one that shaped citizens from the inside out. In 1763, Frederick the Great issued the Generalanschulreglement, a decree making primary education compulsory for all children. The message was unmistakable. Every child would sit in a classroom. Every child would be taught discipline, obedience, loyalty. Education became the state's invisible weapon, molding soldiers and subjects long before they could ever lift a musket. The blueprint sharpened after disaster struck in 1806, when Napoleon humiliated Prussia, Jena and Auerstedt. The nation was shaken to its core. How could this mighty military machine crumble so swiftly? Philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte offered an answer. The problem was not merely military, it was cultural. The people themselves, he argued, needed remolding. In his addresses to the German nation of 1808, Fichte declared that schools must mold the nation. The individual will had to be erased. Children were not to see themselves as separate, but as threads woven into a single national fabric. Education became a crucible, burning away individuality, forging a collective identity. Across the Atlantic, the young United States faced its own crises. Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, both revealed a terrifying truth: the people might rise against their own government. To Thomas Jefferson and other elites, the solution was clear: education. Teach the masses just enough: how to read, how to write, how to obey civic order. Teach them that dissent belonged at the ballot box, not at the muzzle of a musket. For Jefferson, the stakes were existential. Education was the fence keeping democracy from sliding into chaos. But make no mistake, this was not a fence built to lift everyone higher. It was built to contain, to restrain rebellion, to preserve stability. Then came the Industrial Revolution, a force that transformed everything. Suddenly, societies no longer needed peasants bound to the fields or artisans devoted to their craft. What they needed were workers. But not just any workers. They needed people who were punctual, people who could repeat the same task for endless hours, people who followed instructions without question, who respected managers without resistance. And so, the factory demanded its human counterpart, the school. Look closely at the architecture of schooling that emerged. The bell, a sharp command dictating when to start, when to stop. Training children to surrender their time to external clocks. The age-graded class, as if students were products stamped with a manufacture date, processed in uniform batches. The compartmentalized subject, knowledge sliced into rigid blocks, echoing the division of labor on the factory floor. The standardized test, a quality control check, ensuring each product met the state specifications before moving further down the line. The resemblance was no accident. Industrialists themselves, men like John D. Rockefeller, invested heavily in shaping schools. Through ventures like the General Education Board, Rockefeller openly declared his aim to produce docile, sober, and punctual workers. In other words, the factory required a feeder system, and schools became that pipeline. But who drew these blueprints? Who put pen to paper, translating fear, crisis, and economic demand into actual policy? Enter Horace Mann, the so-called father of American public education. Mann spoke the language of idealism. He called education the great equalizer. He traveled tirelessly championing free, tax-funded schools. Yet listen closely to his warnings. Without universal education, society risked the vices of disorder and the hostility of the classes. After touring Prussia in 1843, Mann returned convinced. Professional teachers, standardized curricula, disciplined classrooms. These were the solutions. But behind his rhetoric of equality, one can hear the echo of order, obedience, and social control. He was not alone. Calvin Stowe praised the Prussian model for its ability to produce a disciplined citizenry. Henry Barnard pushed reforms across Connecticut and Rhode Island, insisting on uniform standards. Meanwhile, in Prussia itself, Fichte's philosophy gave the intellectual backbone. Schools as instruments to erase individual will in favor of national cohesion. These figures are remembered as reformers, but they were also architects, designers of a system that sought harmony through homogeneity. The machinery of education was never only political, it was deeply philosophical. Centuries ago, Machiavelli, in The Prince, argued that rulers must prioritize power and control, sometimes at the expense of morality. He never penned a manual for schools, yet his cold logic seeps into the structure. Better to train subjects who wait for permission than to raise citizens who dare to act boldly on their own. Fast forward to the 20th century, Marxist thinkers sharpen the critique. Louis Althusser branded schools the ultimate ideological state apparatus. Unlike armies or police, who rule through force, schools govern through belief. They assign children their place in the social order, not through words, but through routine, expectation, and those invisible boundaries we all learn to obey. Antonio Gramsci carried the thought further. His idea of cultural hegemony revealed how ruling classes shape not just laws, but common sense itself. In classrooms everywhere, competition, respect for authority, and property relations appear not as ideology, but as natural, unquestionable, and so education manufactures consent. To be fair, the story of education isn't only one of manipulation. Reformers like Horace Mann truly believed schools could fight poverty and crime. Compulsory schooling did raise literacy rates, sometimes dramatically. It opened doors for women, for immigrants, for the marginalized. For countless families, the classroom was not a cage, but a bridge to a better life. And historians remind us, the so-called factory model critique, often oversimplified. Schools were never shaped by a single vision. Some were authoritarian, others liberating. Many classrooms held space for genuine intellectual growth, for sparks of curiosity. Yet, here lies the paradox. Even with the best intentions, the machinery of schooling tilted toward standardization, toward control. The results? Persistent inequalities, the stifling of creativity, and that eerie resemblance to industrial systems that we can't quite ignore. The blueprint of modern education was not born from chance. It was forged in rebellion, refined in crisis, perfected in the age of industry. Its very DNA carries both noble ideals and hidden chains. So the question is, when you step into a modern classroom, are you entering a sanctuary of learning, or the polished echo of an old design meant to shape you into something else? In the next chapter, we will see how this blueprint spread across the globe, how nations adopted it, resisted it, or bent it to their own purposes. But one truth remains. The classroom has always been more than a place of learning. It has been a battlefield for the soul of society. Walk into a classroom in Beijing, Boston, Berlin, or Lagos, and you'll see something familiar. Rows of desks, a teacher standing at the front, students waiting, sometimes nervously, sometimes passively, for the next instruction. The blueprint we uncovered in Chapter 1 was never confined to Prussia or the United States. It spread, it adapted, mutated, reshaped by culture, by politics, by economics, and yet everywhere. One haunting question lingers. Are we raising thinkers or followers? Take the United States, a nation that prides itself on individualism, creativity, freedom, and yet, since the early 2000s, its schools have been consumed by a single obsession, the test. With policies like No Child Left Behind, and later the Every Student Succeeds Act, education became a race to produce data points. Teachers, under relentless pressure, began teaching to the test. Arts, music, play, one by one, squeezed out. Creativity became collateral damage. Think about it. What message does a child receive when every lesson ends with a bubble sheet, when every success is reduced to a number, and every mistake is punished with a lower grade? They learn that compliance matters more than curiosity, that memorizing facts is safer than asking questions. Now, travel to China, where conformity takes on its most extreme form. The Gaokao, a single high-stakes exam, determines the trajectory of a student's entire life. Families bend their existence around this test. Children sacrifice childhood for endless drills, endless memorization. The system forges some of the world's most disciplined learners, fueling China's astonishing rise in science and technology. But critics, including Chinese educators themselves, warn of the cost. When knowledge is mastered only to be repeated, who remains to question, to innovate, to invent something truly new? Elsewhere, we see variations. Germany's tripartite system channels students into different tracks: academic, technical, vocational, at an age when many are barely teenagers, locking class divisions into place. Japan and South Korea push students to their limits with long hours and relentless exams. Yes, they achieve remarkable results in math and science, but what is the cost to mental health, to creativity, to joy? And then there's Finland. No standardized testing, no rigid hierarchy. Teachers trusted as professionals. Classrooms alive with collaboration, inquiry, and play. Finland's students not only score among the highest in global rankings, but they also report greater well-being, deeper engagement. It is living proof that conformity is not destiny, it is a design choice. But not every nation had that privilege. In India, Nigeria, and much of Africa, education systems inherited from colonial powers still echo their original intent, producing clerks, administrators, obedient bureaucrats. Local languages, cultural wisdom, entire knowledge systems, sidelined in favor of imported curricula. The legacy persists, leaving many students adrift, disconnected from the realities of their own communities. So across the globe, the spectrum stretches from rigid conformity to fragile, hard-won pockets of resistance. Yet the core question still lingers. What kind of human being does each system actually produce? Here lies one of the most fascinating contradictions, the good student paradox. Consider this. The very students who shine brightest within the system, the ones who memorize flawlessly, follow every rule, ace every test, are often the ones who stumble when confronted with ambiguity, with risk, with challenges that refuse neat structure. In the United States, research shows that elementary classrooms centered on test preparation can indeed boost scores, but at the cost of genuine engagement. Students conditioned to expect clear answers grow frustrated when asked to wrestle with problems that demand perseverance. In India, the race toward elite engineering exams like the JEE consumes entire teenage years. Thousands emerge brilliant at formulas, yet lacking real-world problem-solving skills. Burnout is epidemic. A 2023 study revealed that more than 20% of Indian students in these tracks suffer severe stress or depression. The exam rewards compliance, but punishes imagination. In Brazil, the paradox gains a cultural edge. For many black students, being the so-called good student means conforming to norms set by a dominant white society. Code switching, adopting behaviors that erase identity. Success comes at the cost of authenticity. The lesson is sobering. Excelling in conformity does not guarantee thriving in freedom. Entrepreneurship demands boldness, taking risks, failing forward, breaking boundaries. Yet what does traditional education teach? Don't fail, stay in your lane, master one subject, don't question the rubric. Is it any wonder that some of history's most transformative entrepreneurs, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, walked away from the system entirely? Jobs dropped out but stumbled into a calligraphy class that would later shape Apple's elegant design. Gates and Zuckerberg left Harvard because the rigid structures couldn't keep pace with their vision. Even today, programs like Peter Thiel's Thiel Fellowship pay young innovators to skip college and build companies instead. Why? Because the very qualities schools punish, risk-taking, interdisciplinarity, failure, are the lifeblood of entrepreneurship. Education tells us failure is final. Innovation tells us failure is feedback, and the clash between the two could not be starker. Perhaps the most insidious legacy of conformity-driven schooling is passivity. The message is subtle but powerful. Knowledge flows one way, from teacher to student, from textbook to notebook, from authority to follower. Picture a lecture hall with 300 students. One professor speaks, hundreds scribble. No questions, no debate, just consumption. Or a K-12 classroom where textbooks dictate what counts as knowledge, and students learn to recite rather than create. Even in medical schools, where lives depend on questioning assumptions, students often sit passively, memorizing for exams, instead of cultivating diagnostic reasoning. The result? Generations trained not to act, but to wait. Not to create, but to consume. Not to question, but to comply. And yet, research shows that active learning, collaboration, projects, peer-led inquiry boosts understanding by 30 to 50%. Still, the traditional model remains stubborn, efficient, churning out graduates who have mastered one lesson above all: how to sit still and listen. If we lay the systems side by side, a striking contrast emerges. In the United States, standardized testing narrows the mind, yet defenders argue it offers equity through measurable accountability. In China, the Gaokao enforces discipline, mastery of knowledge, but at the expense of creativity, of well-being. Finland proves another way is possible. No testing, yet higher performance and greater joy. In Nigeria, colonial legacies still shape classrooms. They stifle local innovation, even as they provide national unity. And in Germany, early tracking perpetuates class divisions, even while producing skilled vocational workers. Each model reflects a choice: what to prioritize and what to sacrifice. Across the globe, the classroom is a mirror. Sometimes it reflects discipline and stability. Other times it reflects anxiety, passivity, or lost potential. The blueprint of conformity is alive and well, but so are seeds of resistance. So here is the question: as the world faces new challenges, automation, AI, climate crises, will our schools continue to produce compliant followers, or will they finally embrace the courage to raise independent thinkers, creators, and dreamers? In our next chapter, we confront this head-on: the clash between an education system designed for the factories of yesterday and the uncertain future of tomorrow. Have you ever stopped to wonder, what exactly are we preparing our children for? Is it the world they're about to inherit, or a world that vanished decades ago? Our schools, those grand institutions that shaped us, our parents, even our grandparents, remain bound to 19th century blueprints. Bells ringing, rows of desks, standardized tests, a system designed for factories, for steam engines, for clerical offices. But here's the problem: that world is gone. And in its place, something far more powerful, far more unpredictable is rising: artificial intelligence. This chapter takes us straight into the collision point between yesterday's education and tomorrow's reality. It is a story of crisis, but also, if we dare to reimagine, one of empowerment and transformation. Let's face it, the very skills schools have drilled into us for over a century, obedience, punctuality, memorization, following instructions, are now the very skills AI performs better, faster, cheaper. According to the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report, up to 85 million jobs may vanish by 2030. Think about that. Millions of people trained for stability, suddenly obsolete, But before despair sets in, here's the twist. The same forces wiping out jobs are expected to create 90 to 100 million new ones. So the question isn't will there be jobs? The question is who will be ready for them? Because these new roles demand what machines still struggle to replicate: creativity, curiosity, empathy, adaptability, complex problem solving. Let that sink in. The very things our schools sideline, don't daydream, don't question too much, stay on task, are the survival skills of the future. The truth is, education is no longer something that ends at graduation. It has to become lifelong, and this is where self-directed learning enters, not as a luxury, but as a lifeline when you follow your own curiosity. Whether it's learning graphic design on Canva or diving into Python through a free online course, you're not just collecting skills, you're training a deeper muscle, the ability to teach yourself. And in a world where industries rise and fall within a decade, that ability is gold. Studies in psychology reveal that when we learn by choice, not compulsion, we remember more, persist longer, and even enjoy the process. Isn't that what learning was meant to feel like all along? For parents, this realization is transformative, opening doors to robotics clubs, art workshops, community projects, and for students, it's the moment of truth. Your education is not owned by a classroom, it's owned by you. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This empowerment isn't equally accessible. Imagine two children. One attends a well-funded private school, surrounded by coding camps, art studios, global exchange programs. The other sits in an overcrowded public classroom that täglich standardized tests. Both will face the same AI-driven future, but only one is being prepared to thrive. This is the moral fault line of our time. If education systems do not adapt, inequality won't just persist, it will explode. The divide won't be between those who work with machines and those who don't, but between those trained for creativity and leadership and those left behind with skills the machines have already taken. And so, reform is not just about making schools better, it is about justice, about ensuring the tools of tomorrow belong to everyone, not just the privileged few. So, what does a future-ready education look like? It's not about tearing down structure, it's about redesigning it. Imagine schools where portfolios replace test scores, where students are judged not just on what they know, but on what they can create, where teachers aren't just instructors, but mentors, helping students question, connect, explore, where AI doesn't replace teachers, but stands beside them, freeing them from grading worksheets so they can focus on mentoring truly human skills, empathy, resilience, innovation. For individuals, the call is clear. Adopt a growth mindset, treat failure not as shame, but as feedback. Build a portfolio, a living proof of skills in action, whether it's a blog, a project, or a community initiative. And above all, stay curious, because curiosity is the one thing machines can't automate. By 2030, the numbers will be clear. Millions of jobs lost, millions created. And the winners will be those who learned not just to survive change, but to harness it. Traditional education may still provide a foundation, but self-directed, creative learning will decide who truly thrives. So the real question isn't whether AI will take over. The real question is, will we rise to meet it? Because the future of learning isn't about machines replacing us. It's about redefining what it means to be human in the age of machines. And that perhaps is the most exciting classroom humanity has ever entered. The age of conformity in education is ending, and the age of creativity is just beginning. The question is, are we ready to step into it? Education. It has always been more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic. At its core, it is a story we tell about who we are and who we wish to become. For centuries, that story was written by kings, industrialists, politicians, men who believed schools should produce order, loyalty, efficiency. But what happens when a system built for obedience collides with a world that demands innovation, resilience, creativity? This is the choice now before us, a choice of futures. History has shown us. Schools were never neutral, they were tools, sometimes engines of opportunity, sometimes instruments of control. That legacy still lingers today. But now, automation and artificial intelligence have raised the stakes higher than ever. What good is an education that teaches conformity when conformity is exactly what machines excel at? The crisis is clear. Our schools are preparing millions for a world that no longer exists. But within every crisis lies an opportunity. Imagine classrooms that are not factories of standardization, but ecosystems of creativity. Imagine young minds trained not to memorize answers, but to ask the questions no one else dares to ask. Imagine an education system that doesn't just prepare workers, but empowers human beings to flourish, adapt, and lead in an uncertain future. This is not utopia, it is a choice, a deliberate reimagining of what education could be. We stand at a crossroads. Will we continue to educate for obedience, or will we educate for agency? Will our schools remain silent factories of the past, or will they become living laboratories for the future? The decision we make will determine far more than careers. It will shape our economies, our democracies, our very ability to confront the greatest challenges of the 21st century: climate change, inequality, technological disruption. The future of learning is not written in stone. It is written in our choices. The choice to empower, the choice to liberate, the choice to prepare, not merely for survival in an AI age, but for human flourishing. The 12 Vision 65's 3 months. Helki. The question is not whether education will shape our future. The question is, what kind of future do we dare to shape?